right, welcome back everyone. And here we are in our new story of the Renaissance, the birth of the modern world. And so we're going to kind of go through this lecture here. And let me just kind of start by giving you the big objective, what I really want you to understand out of this lecture. And there's really two basic points. Number one is, how is the Renaissance very different, the new modern world, different from the Middle Ages? And we're basically talking about the time between 1400 and 1600 AD, right? That 200-year period. How is it different in the Middle Ages? And number two, the other big objective is how so many of the things that happened during the Renaissance are still with us today, right? This is the part of the modern world. One of the things about any modern history is understanding, look at how we are today. Why are we the way we are? And a lot of the things that happened during the Renaissance impact us today. And so we're going to see some of that as well as we go through our story here. All right, so that's essentially what we're doing here. And we'll go through our keywords here in a second, and we'll start with that. So here we are, just a few key words. You already have the word Renaissance, obviously, from the first slide there. Make sure you get that down. And then Italy, Dante, Divine Comedy. We'll talk about that. The Inferno, I put it twice. Virgil and vernacular, right? And so I'm going to explain all those words. You're going to have other sets of keywords. This is keywords number one. You'll have another set of keywords later, right? So just be aware of that. All right, you're going to have a few here. So let's just go to our map of Italy. And here we are in Italy where the Renaissance begins. So let's start with the most basic thing. What does the word Renaissance mean, right? Well, the word Renaissance basically means rebirth, right? And it means rebirth of the Greco-Roman world. And it means the rebirth of the science, the math, the literature, all of that stuff that kind of disappeared during the Middle Ages comes back. So anything that the Greeks and the Romans developed would happen. Why does the Renaissance start in Italy first? Why doesn't it start in France or England? Why does it begin in Italy and then spreads everywhere else? Well, a few reasons. So I guess there's like three factors I could think of. And again, anytime I say there are three factors, 1, 2, 3, of why the Renaissance starts in Italy first. I would say one, it's the center of the Greco-Roman world, right? This is where ancient Greece was, ancient Rome was. So it makes sense you're going to have the Renaissance starting there. Number two, so if number one, it's just the center of the Greco-Roman world. Number two, it's a center of trade. If you look at Italy, of course, it juts out in the Mediterranean Sea, a lot of trade, and with lots of trade, a lot of ideas come. You have a lot of ideas that came from the Eastern world into Italy, and so a lot of the ideas that were lost in the Middle Ages come back, and because of the center of trade, that's where you have a lot of flourishing of ideas. Number three is money, right? I think that's another factor of why the Renaissance starts in Italy first. The money will drive much of the Renaissance, and Italy is very wealthy. They have a lot of ports, a lot of cities, a lot of wealth, and that will drive them. So I think those are the three major factors. I mean, another one maybe you could throw in there is the Black Death. The Black Death probably started in Italy first, so it ended in Italy first. So maybe they have a little bit of jump on things. But essentially, those are the three major reasons why the Renaissance begins in Italy first. So again, it's not just to write down enough Italy, write down the word Italy. You're also explaining why the Renaissance starts there. So we know what it means, right? We know when, again, the Renaissance are about 1400 to 1600 AD. And so that's the time period that we're talking about. And, in terms of why Italy, those reasons I mentioned. Now, the next point is this. You don't go to sleep at night in 1399 and you're living in this medieval world, and then you wake up in 1400 and boom, everything's modern and everything's new that we're going to talk about today. There is a transition. And so I always do mention this one guy named Dante. Dante is a writer from Italy. And again, anytime you see these words, it's not enough just to write down the word. Everything I say about the person you want to get down. So Dante, he's writing in Italy in the 1300s, right? So technically, the way I like to talk about Dante is I say he's kind of got one foot in the Middle Ages, right? We'll put M, A, Middle Ages. and he's got one foot in the Renaissance. He's kind of parallels. He's kind of this transitional figure from one time period to another time period. What do I mean by that? How is he a figure of the Middle Ages? Well, he's writing in the 1300s. So he's writing clearly in a time period of the Middle Ages. His book, The Divine Comedy, or the Inferno, which is part of the Divine Comedy is broken up into 3 books, is all about faith. It's all about religion. It's all about the church. It's all about salvation. And so you say, well, okay, clearly, this is a person, Dante, who's a medieval figure. He's writing in the Middle Ages. He's writing about faith. Even his book, The Divine Comedy, is broken up into 3 books, and every book has 33 chapters. That's not an accident, right? The number 3. Remember, we talked about trial by ordeals, how 3 was a religious number. And so everything about Dante on the surface makes him look like he is a medieval writer, a person from the Middle Ages. But he's also got a couple of traits that make him a modern writer, that make him somebody more we would associate with the Renaissance. What do I mean by that? Well, one of the characteristics, if you ever read Dante's Inferno, for those of you who haven't read it, it's a fun little read. It's basically he's going through the different levels of hell, and he's describing the different levels of hell, and he's got a guide with him. And the question is who is his guide? And his guide is this man named Virgil. And Virgil is the guide of Dante. And who is Virgil? Well, Virgil is a Roman writer. That's Virgil. He's a Roman writer. If the Renaissance is the rebirth through the Greco-Roman world, it makes sense that a Renaissance writer would use an ancient Roman writer as his guide. Hope you're following me on this. So in other words, if Dante was purely a medieval writer, who would he use as his guide? A religious figure, a pope, a saint, whatever. But he decides to go all the way back to the ancient Romans and pick a man named Virgil to be his guide. That's a Renaissance characteristic. It's a characteristic of the modern world. So I hope you kind of understand what I'm saying with that. The other interesting point about Dante is when he writes the story of the Divine Comedy, it's the language he writes it in. And one of the key words I gave you there was the term vernacular. And what does that term vernacular mean? Well, vernacular is a fancy-smancy word. You do want to know it. It means writing in the spoken language of the people. So again, every time you see these key words, you're rewriting them in your notes, you're defining them. So vernacular means spoken language of the people. So if you live in France, you write in French. You live in Germany, you write in German. You live in England, you write in English. You live in Italy, you write in Italian. He writes this in Italian. In the Middle Ages, everything was written in Latin. Nobody reads and writes Latin anymore. Everybody today, of course, reads and writes in the vernacular. Guys, that's a characteristic of the modern world. It's one of those things that starts in the Renaissance that we still do today. It's not small. I want you to think about, why does it matter that people start writing in the vernacular? Well, the vernacular, the spoken language of the people, means that more people are now going to have access to information and ideas, as opposed to Latin. Who reads and writes in Latin? Well, the church, and that's it, and a few, elite nobles maybe. And so really the reality is that, this now opens up a lot of information. So I talk about Dante because, yes, he's a transitional figure, but I also talk about Dante because he serves to give us kind of the first characteristic of how the modern world is different in the Middle Ages. We go from Latin to the vernacular, and we see this in Dante's writings as well. All right, so I hope all that's clear. So we talked about, the term Renaissance. We explained why the Renaissance starts in Italy. We explained the transition. So hopefully all that you understand before we move on to our next slide, as we begin to look at other characteristics of the modern world and how they're so different than the Middle Ages. All right, so that was one good example. We're going to go through several more. So here are the key words for economic changes from the Middle Ages to the modern world. So let's explain all of these. Each of these is incredibly important to our world today. I'm going to hopefully be able to show you what I mean by that, and you'll understand how these terms are important to our world today. So there's basically 3 major economic industries that are going to be important. And again, if I say there are 3 economic industries, 1, 2, 3, right? The first one, banking. Second one, global trade. And the third one is going to be printing. And then you've got some other names there associated with each one, which we'll explain. So let's start with banking, right? So banking was around before the modern world. It wasn't though that all of a sudden people decided to create banks. But it's how a bank works that's so important, that explains why banking wasn't very important in the Middle Ages, and the modern world and today becomes a big part of our life. There's a term here you see, usury. What does that term usury mean? Well, usury is just a fancy word meaning loaning money on interest. In the Middle Ages, the church said usury is wrong. You cannot charge people interest for money. In other words, if I give you $100, I can only expect $100 back. Lovely. Not much motivation to open up a bank. Well, as we move into the modern world, I already explained to you that the power of the church goes down. The church has lost a lot of its influence, a lot of its control, and therefore nobody really cares what the church says anymore. I don't say nobody cares, but they don't care as much as they used to. And so you still want to be nice with the church, but the church is not going to be able to demand no more usury. And so now that the church leaves that demand, then yeah, I could give you $100. You owe me $110, $120, whatever we agree to. Then I just made $20 for basically loaning you money. That's usury. Good. And so all of a sudden the banking industry begins to grow and flourish. And I want you to think about this. Does banking impact our world today? And of course, the obvious answer is beyond yes. I mean, if we shut down our banks tomorrow, we'd have, Lord of the Flies. It'd be just insanity. And, think of all the things that we can't do without banking industry. We can't, have a house. You want to buy a house, right? Who goes and buys a house cash? Nobody buys a house cash. You go to the bank, you get a loan. Each month when you get your loan, you pay your mortgage. And by the way, I don't know if anybody ever realized this, but the first four letters in the word mortgage, mort, is mortuary, death. So, kind of keep that in mind. Just a little side note there. But, we can't do that. You can't open up a business. How do you open up a business without a bank? Very few people can open up a business unless they can go to a bank and get a business loan. And if you can't open up business, how do you create work? How do you create jobs? Guys, ask yourself this question. When is the last time somebody making minimum wage gave you a job? Doesn't work that way. Who gives jobs? Who creates work? People with money, right? If they don't have money, if you don't have businesses, you don't have jobs. You can't have capitalism. For all the flaws of capitalism, Winston Churchill once said democracy is the worst form of government than all the others. I think you could say the same thing about capitalism. Capitalism is the worst form of economics except all the others. The reality is, every economic system has its flaws, but there's only been one economic system in human history that has actually been proven to raise people out of poverty, and that is capitalism. That never happens without the banking industry, right? And later, we'll talk about, and in History 111, we talk a lot about the Industrial Revolutions, the positives, the negatives. One of the things I always try to do is give different perspectives. What are the positive things? What are the negative things? To give you the full picture of things. But none of this happens without banking. So that's one. That's one really important economic industry. Number two, trade. Now, you've always had trade, right? But this is different. Now what we have is global trade. So that's the key word. Don't just say, well, a new economic industry have trade. No, that's ridiculous. We've had trade since cavemen. I'll trade you my rock for your rock, right? Now we're talking about global trade. Go to your house and just look at things in your house and what is made in Cypress, California. My guess is nothing is made in Cypress, California. Where is everything made? Oh, China. Other than China, Latin America, other countries in Asia, lots of places in the world, we have stuff. In the modern world, you have the global trade beginning, 1400 to 1600, the age of exploration, right? 1492, Columbus set sail the ocean blue. Magellan, what are all these guys looking for? They're looking for global trade routes. And, try to imagine our world today without trade. How do we function? All the things you have, your computers, your gadgets, your food, your clothing, everything. We just can't survive without global trade today. And that's something that begins during the Renaissance. So this is something different. You didn't have global trade you had some global trade in the Middle Ages. Actually, if you think about it, Marco Polo, right? The story of Marco Polo, that starts at the end of the Middle Ages. But a true sense of big global trade everywhere from Asia to Africa to Latin America to, Europe, of course, that really develops in the early modern world, the Renaissance period. So that's important, and again, a very impact on our lives today. The third economic industry is the printing industry. And when we talk about the printing industry, of course, we need to know the key guy, the one name that I'm giving you here. I'm not giving you a lot of names of people in this lecture, but this is definitely a person you want to know, a man named Johann Gutenberg. And with a name like Gutenberg, he is, of course, from Germany. So here he is. There's Gutenberg again. And Gutenberg is the man in Germany in 1455. And again, this is again another example. No, you don't need to memorize 1455. Gutenberg invents the printing press. You don't need to memorize that exact date. As long as you know circa 1400s, mid 1400s, we're good. But in 1455, Gutenberg is going to invent the printing press. And in many ways, this is even more important to our world today than trade or banking. And if you think of how important trade or banking is, it's pretty stunning. This is what the printing press looks like. And you go, well, why is this so important? So let's go through this step by step, right? The first reason the Gutenberg press is significant is because it allows for the creation of books faster, right? The time it takes me to write one book by hand, this thing can create thousands. If I have multiple of these, I can create tens of thousands. So that's step one. Step two, right? There's a few steps to this. So that's one. Step two, books become cheaper. Step three, more people can read and write, more literacy. Now, I don't want you to think 1455, he invents the printing press, 1460, everyone can read, right? It doesn't work that way. It's still going to take a number of years before everyone can read and write. But at least you're still getting to a point where more people are going to be literate, right? So it does increase literacy. But step four, and most significantly, is what is going to be written and how is it going to impact society. Now that you can produce more things and more people are literate, what that means is things like the Bible, the Gutenberg Bible is going to be written. Well, you have the Gutenberg Bible. Well, that means more people can read the Bible. And if I could read the Bible myself, I could read it myself and I can interpret it myself. And then if I interpret it myself, I could say, I don't agree with the way the Catholic Church is interpreting the Bible. I'm Christian, I believe in Christianity, but I think it's being interpreted the wrong way. I will create my own version of Christianity. That's where you get the Protestant Reformation. So that's pretty big, right? Think of how many people there are Catholics, but think of how many Christians there are not Catholics. And once you have these new ideas, then it's a cycle. Then the printing press allows you to spread these ideas and more people, ooh, I like that idea, right? There's an old saying, if a tree falls in a forest and there's nobody's there, does it make a sound? Well, in this case, no. You can have the most brilliant idea in the world. If you have no way to get it out there, it dies. And so the printing press now allows those ideas to get out there. So you can write about religion, science, right? You can write about how the world works. And so it's not a coincidence. Shortly after the printing press, you get the scientific revolution, right? You can write about politics. And so you eventually get, I don't want a king to have all the power. And so you get the Enlightenment ideas, the US Revolution. You have all these, remarkable new ideas that create the United States and the French Revolution, all these new thoughts that change society politically. So that's why the printing press is really important. It's not just an economic industry. I kind of group it with the economics, but reality goes way beyond being an economic industry. So I hope you understand all of that. So printing press, really important. So those are the three big economic industries you need to be familiar with. So we have the banking, the global trade, and the printing. And again, for each one, you want to be able to not just know them, but understand the details, the words that I gave you associated with them in terms of what's going on there. All right, so I hope all that's clear. Let's move on. All right, so these are the key words for the social changes from the Middle Ages to the modern world. So we talked about the economic changes, now the social changes. So let's run through a few of these, and we'll start with the first one there on the list, of course, the term secularism and humanism. Those kind of go together. So in the Middle Ages, pretty much everything revolved around the church. In the modern world, in the Renaissance, people are still religious. I don't want you to think that all of a sudden, oh, people don't believe in religion anymore. No, they are. People are still very religious. But there are these new ideas. What is secularism? Secularism is simply defined as non-religious. Saying, in other words, yes, I believe in the afterlife. I like the afterlife, but there's a lot of good things in this life as well. I want to enjoy this life, the secular world. That's what secularism means. Humanism, humanism means man-centered, that man is capable of all things, not just God. So those are two ideas that develop in the Renaissance. Now, are those ideas with us today? And the answer is absolutely they're with us today. And where are they stronger? They're actually stronger in Europe than the United States, especially secularism. And, how do you see this? What do I mean by secularism being really strong in Europe, moving away from God? Well, if you go to churches in Europe today, you don't see, families going to church and praying on Sundays like you do in much of the United States of America. In California's more like Europe, right? You don't see much of that in California. And again, whether this is good or bad, that's not my job to kind of let you guys all know. You can kind of decide all this stuff yourself, but I want you to kind of understand the differences of how it's a secular world in Europe and in places like California, and other a lot of coastal areas. Children. Who has more children, religious people or secular people? Well, religious people of any faith. More religious people have more children. Secular people don't have as many children. And in Europe, a lot of people aren't aware of this. If you take out immigration, the population of Europe in some countries is flat, if not declining a little bit. Why? Because they're not having a lot of kids. Why? Because they're so secular. They just want to enjoy this life. They don't want the responsibilities of a child and all of that. And so they're more secular. I kind of, as somebody who's a father, I could tell you, having a child is the greatest gift in the world. It gives you so much fulfillment and purpose. But a lot of people don't recognize that sometimes. And so, they have less children. So that's what makes them more secular. Another point I always bring up here, because this is, I think, important to think about. A lot of times I'll throw things out just to make people think, right? And question things sometimes, because, we oftentimes hear of religious extremism, and there is, right? You could do great things in the name of religion, and people have done bad things in the name of religion. Well, it's the same thing with secularism. Can you develop good things out of secularism? Sure, right? Humanism, man-centered, man is capable of all things, of course. But there's also really extremes of this, right? If you think of communism, for example, communism is a secular ideology. It takes away God. It takes away religion. Fascism, Nazism, those were secular. Those were non-religious movements. And so you could take anything to an extreme, and I think that's kind of an important note to note as well on all this. All right, so just some things to think about. All right, and the next one is individualism. What do I mean by that? Well, think in your mind right now. Can you name yourself any artists from the Middle Ages? And you're probably, oh, I don't know any artists from the Middle Ages. Were there artists in the Middle Ages? Well, there were a lot of artists in the Middle Ages. I don't expect anybody to know any of them. Now, if I were to ask you, name me some artists from the Renaissance, and you're thinking, oh, okay, I know some of them. I know there's Leonardo and Raphael and Donatello, all the Ninja Turtles, and I can even think of other artists from the modern world, and Picasso and Rembrandt. I know them. I've heard of them. Why is it? And the reason you know the artists of the modern world, but not of the Middle Ages, is because of individualism. You know what the artists of the modern world begin to do? Start signing their work. Why? Because they wanted individualism and, just another term I'll just write up here, fame, right? They wanted to be known. They wanted everybody knew they were. Michelangelo, famous beyond belief. Everybody knew who Michelangelo was, even at his time. And so, very, very famous because they wanted that. They strived for that. Hey, it's me. I did this. I did this. And so, I always say, is that part of our world today? And I say sometimes, oh my God, fame is kind of a disease today. We've sometimes confused fame for significance in our society today. People oftentimes know the most famous person, but not the more important people in society. So, anyways, but those are things that start during the Renaissance. Okay. So those are three kind of key words, go together: secularism, humanism, and individualism. All right, the next characteristic, social change, we're still on social changes obviously here, from the Middle Ages to the modern world, is nobility. What if you were a noble in the Middle Ages, right? Nobles in the Middle Ages, their job was to fight. What if you're a noble in the modern world? Well, if you're a noble in the modern world, you need to do much more than fight. And there's a really good source called the Book of the Courtier, written by a man named Castiglione, right? So this is my copy of it, right? I'm going to go through here in a second with you. It's a primary source. He writes this right during the heart of the Renaissance period, around 1500 AD. And Castiglione essentially describes what a noble is supposed to be like. I'm going to read to you some excerpts. As I read each excerpt, you just jot down the characteristics. And I want you to basically see how different a noble is in the Middle Ages compared to a noble is in the modern world. That's essentially what Castiglione is doing in this book of the courtier, in the book of the courtier. He's describing what your ideal noble should be like. All right, so give me a moment here. Let me find the first page here, and we'll get started. He says, I wish our courtier to be well built with finely proportioned members. I would have him demonstrate strength and lightness and suppleness and be good at all physical exercises and befitting a warrior. Here I believe his first duty is to know how to handle expertly every kind of weapon, either on foot or mounted, to understand all their finer points, and to be especially well informed about all those weapons commonly used among gentlemen. So you need to be able to fight. But, that's so much so far just like the Middle Ages. But he goes on. There are also many other sports which, although do not directly require the use of weapons, are closely related to arms and demand a great deal of manly exertion. Goes on and says, it seems also fitting that the courtier should know how to swim, jump, run, and cast a stone. Another noble sport, which is very suitable for the courtier to play, is tennis. For this shows how well he is built physically and how quick and agile he is in every member. So you need to be able to play sports, not just fight and kill people. Then it gets a little bit more interesting. He says, what the courtier especially requires in order to speak and write well, therefore, is knowledge, because the man who lacks knowledge has nothing in his mind worth hearing, has nothing worth writing or speaking. So that's the third point, right? That you need to be able to be smart and intelligent. And then he gets really specific. Again, you're getting each of these points down as I'm going through them. He says, I should like our courtier to be more than an average scholar, at least in those studies which we call the humanities. He should have knowledge of Greek as well as Latin because of the many different things that are so beautifully written in that language. He should be very well acquainted with the poets, and Noblesse with the orators and historians, and also skilled at writing both verse and prose, especially in our own language. So you need to know how to speak at least 3 languages, right? So that's pretty spectacular. He then goes on and says, gentlemen, I must tell you, I'm not satisfied with our courtier unless he is a musician and he can play several instruments. All right? And he says, I think our courtier should certainly not neglect, and that is the question of drawing and the art of painting itself. And guys, this is just, I don't know if you can see, but just like the beginning part of the book. And so you have to be a painter, a sculptor, a musician, speak languages. We have a term for somebody who could do all this, and it's the term Renaissance man. So that's pretty cool, right? That's one of the other characteristics of the modern world that's different than the Middle Ages. All right, so again, I'm hoping you see how some of these things are still with us today. All right, the next thing there is dowry. We have that term. We saw that in the Middle Ages, so we've seen everything changing, right? The political structure has changed. We have now stronger kings. That's different than what we had in the Middle Ages. The economic structure has changed. The social structure is changing, obviously. What about marriages? Well, doesn't change. This is one thing that does not change from the Middle Ages to the modern world. You're still marrying because it's arranged. Parents still tell you who to marry. You still have a dowry. So that's one thing that does not change. All right? The next few words here, hopefully you have them down because I'm going to go through a few slides. The next kind of development of the modern world that's different than the Middle Ages, science, right? And you could see this in a few images here, right? So this is an embryo. All 3 of these images I'm going to show you here are by Leonardo da Vinci. So here you have the embryo. Here you have the very famous Vitruvian Man. And this is Da Vinci's flying machine. I don't know if you ever played that old game, Assassin's Creed, and you have that in there. But flying machine, no, it never really flew. But the point is, this is all science. Is this the scientific revolution? Not quite yet, but it's on the heels of science. Is science part of our world today? Well, of course science is part of our world today. It's a very big part of our world today. And, when I do a lecture on scientific revolution, we get into a lot of interesting things about science. One of the things I always tell people is you have to distinguish between science and scientists. Scientists are human, they're flawed, they have their biases, they have their agendas. Science is science. And it's very interesting to look at science in that perspective and what it does and the impact it has, and all the things science does for good in society, but also things you can point out that has not done good for society, believe it or not, if you think about it. Think of like Nazi doctors, right? Just they were scientists, but they did horrible things. So it's just kind of interesting to think about. So obviously our world has benefited dramatically from the modern world because of scientific developments. And so we see this in, starting from the period of, the Renaissance with Da Vinci and a few examples there. So that's another characteristic of the modern world. You didn't have much of this at all in the Middle Ages. Now you do. All right, next. Last story here. This is my favorite little story here, architecture. So this is just kind of a fun little story. It's the story of what we call the Duomo in Florence. I've been there. It's gorgeous. It's an amazing cathedral with a big dome. And you can, actually when I do this in class, I use Google Earth and I kind of show students exactly where it is. And I show students the inside of the dome and everything. It's really cool if you want to Google Earth it yourself and look at just go the Duomo in Florence. And it's this beautiful cathedral, but you could see in this image, there's a dome. And the whole deal is when they actually built this cathedral, there was no dome on top because no one knew how to build a dome to it. Until this one guy comes along, a man named Brunelleschi. So this guy named Brunelleschi, I'm going to have I can see an egg here. What's this egg have to do with my story here? I'm going to show you here in a second. So let me go to my next slide here. And the story of Brunelleschi and the egg. What is going on here? So Brunelleschi was this genius architect who basically said, I could build a dome in Florence. And the people in Florence were like desperate. They're like, great, how are you going to do this? And Brunelleschi says, I'm not telling you how I'm going to do this. You just have to trust me. Give me the commission and I will build you the dome. And they all look at him like he's crazy, and what do you mean? We're not just going to give you money. You tell us how you're going to do it, and then we'll build you the dome, and then I'll build, and then we'll give you the money. And they go back and forth and back and forth, and Brunelleschi refuses to tell him how he's going to build the dome, and they demand we're not going to give you a penny unless you tell us how you're going to do this, because he had a reputation of being a crazy guy. So, anyways, he tells him, all right, you don't trust me. I will challenge any architect. Give him all an egg. And any architect who can make an egg stand on its head on a flat surface gets to build a dome, gets the money, no questions asked. So let me show you what's going to happen here. Excuse me. This here. Okay, let's see. Set this up for you. All right, so I know, yeah, I think you can see this well. All right, so here is my flat surface, my table, right? Here is the egg. And this is what Brunelleschi does. Every architect comes trying to make an egg stand on its head on a flat surface. Every single one of them fails. After everyone fails, this is what Brunelleschi does. He takes the egg, takes the flat surface, does like so. See this well? Here it is. Egg standing on its head on a flat surface. There you go. And that's how he does that. And of course, everybody looks at him like, well, that's silly. Anybody could do that if you told us that's what you were going to do. And so Brunelleschi gets the commission. He used a raw egg. I used a hard-boiled egg. It would make a big mess if I used a raw egg when I do this. But it's just a fun little story I like sharing because it is during the Renaissance. It is an example of how you could do anything. Humanism, man is capable of all things. It's also kind of the arrogance that comes with humanism sometimes. It's kind of a double-edged sword. That dome, he does build it. We don't even know exactly how he built it. But it really shows that, there's an arrogance. I could do anything. I don't need to explain to anybody, but then he did it. So kind of cool. So anyways, that's a little quick funny story on Brunelleschi and the dome. The egg, next time you want to challenge, so I bet I can make an egg stand on its head on the flat surface. You could show him how to do that. Well, anyways, that's a little bit of fun stuff. All right, so that's basically it in a nutshell for the Renaissance. All right, so I want you to know the characteristics. Again, those two big themes. How is the Renaissance different than the Middle Ages? And how some of the things in the Renaissance impact the modern world today. So we're going to go on with some more lectures after this. Hope you're all good, and let me know again if you have any questions. Thank you.